Your Holiness, friends, monastics, our scholars and scientists, we're so grateful you're here this morning and that you've been so very present in the course of this meeting. Our meeting has in its title the word ecology, and that is a quite interesting word because it was coined by the biologist Ernst Haeckel at the turn of the last century. And it comes from the Greek word oikos, which means home. And we have been exploring ecology in these past days, looking at the impact of humans on the home. And we recognize that this isn't just our home, but this planet is home for all species. And in addition to that, ecology has a certain orientation that is quite important, and that orientation is based in the study of relationships. And when we talk about the study of relationships in ecology, we're talking about a living system in which organisms are present, and it's about the relationship between those organisms and the environments which support them. The study of ecology also includes, as Diana has brought to our attention, the extraordinary impact that one species has had on the planet. And as Claire has pointed out, we are a species with a prefrontal cortex, a neocortex, and we have the capacity to actually cultivate compassion, and as well to engage in behaviors which are very dissociated from a kind of compassionate base. So there has been an arc to this meeting. And that arc or narrative has begun with an area that you really love, which is science. And I want to thank Diana, Jonathan, and Greg for their contribution to a deeper understanding of something in Buddhism that is very present for us, which is the second piece of our, or the third piece of our title of our conference, which is Interdependence. Diana gave a very vivid presentation, which began with a map of the sort of geological ages. And we see all of a sudden something happening after the Holocene, which Paul Kreutzmann has called the Anthropocene. And that is a very powerful shift in environmental and ecological conditions predicated on the impact of humans on the planet vis-a-vis population and the utilization of what we call as resources, which I think, from my point of view, is not the best word for, I don't know what another word would be, but the word resource implies that we can just take and take and take from the planet. And she has well defined something that she called the Great Acceleration. That is, since the post-war period, since the end of World War II, around 1950, there's been an extraordinary acceleration of the degradation of planetary health. And Jonathan also brought this clearly into our vision in terms of the impact on human health with regards to our patterns of consumption and the commodification, really, of the planet. And the commodification, as Mathieu pointed out, of many species on this planet. So I want to thank you, Diana, for your mapping of this, because a word that you used later on in the conference, a few days later, I think is a word that I want to put in the middle of our deliberations this morning, vis-a-vis what Elke is going to be exploring. And that is, you said, Diana said, I feel a great sense of urgency. And I want to say that I feel everyone in this room should as well feel a great sense of urgency. We have 3 unsafe zones, 3 domains of life on this planet that have moved to the tipping point. And that these are climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and nitrogen pollution. And we have a number of others that are moving areas of our life, life on this planet, that are moving into the unsafe zone. And this, Jonathan, you used the word generational responsibility. You used the term future people. We are living in a situation where we are literally shaping our future. Jonathan then went through a very powerful presentation on the relationship between environmental impacts and human health. And his point, I think there are 2 points that I want to just underline here as we're getting to Elke's presentation. One is that the major impact that is being felt is among people who are so-called poor, among those who have less economically. And that is the majority on our planet. So that the 20%, so to speak, that Sally was speaking about is controlling the destiny not only of the poor, but really of all species. Jonathan also made an important point, and that is that small interventions can be significant. And I think so often when we see the big picture, it's very difficult for us to actually feel we can do something. We feel a sense of helplessness. But Jonathan made it clear that, even doing shorter car trips makes a difference in terms of greenhouse gases. Greg's presentation, he's an industrial ecologist, and his presentation, I think, was very relevant to us. We could hold up one sheet of paper, and it looks just like a local sheet of paper, but what we recognize, in fact, that the manufacture of this sheet of paper impacts almost every country on the planet. And as well, as Greg pointed out, like the iPhone or a piece of paper, over 1 million people are impacted by every product that is manufactured. So he studies the science of footprints. And the mapping of the resources, so-called, that are used to produce even the simplest product that Greg does, puts the onus of responsibility on at least 2 different categories, or 2 different categories. One is that individuals should know what is impacted by the use of paper, one sheet of paper. And as well, corporations should know. And this has to do with moral responsibility at the personal level and the public level, about which Sally was speaking earlier. I want to thank Claire very much now, because what we've seen is we've been presenting a kind of case. It's not a kind of case. We've been presenting a case where we see the human impact on the life of the planet, whether it's the life of forests or the life of a particular society or individual, is profoundly impacted by our decision-making capacities. Elke will also be addressing this. And Claire brought this into focus through her exploration of ethics with us. She explored how we understand our ethical obligations, not just to the human species, but to all species. And that sensibility was brought into our consciousness in a much more granular way by Mathieu, who brought up the issue of the consumption of animals, eating animals, raising animals for human consumption. And that it's not only, Mathieu pointed out, it is not only the issue of the greenhouse gases, it being a major cause of greenhouse gas that we're addressing here, but it's also ethics of just plain compassion. How can we raise animals in such horrendous conditions for our human consumption when there are other sources of protein to keep ourselves healthy? And then Sally. We came to Sally. And you know, over the years as I've sat in these conferences, Your Holiness, I've always been, you know, a little interested in your great emphasis on secularism and your sometimes, what could I say, aversive attitude toward religion. And I think we agree that more people have died.
Sure.
Okay. I don't think that, I think you are very right that more people have died in the name of religion than in the name of real estate, quite frankly. But Sally asked an important question, and that is, can religion be part of the solution? And I really appreciated so much her bringing that into focus. And we're right now, you know, on that sort of edge, the question Sally posed, which is how do we transform belief into responsible and moral action? She also went right to the point of our conference. She said, we need a worldview of interdependence. And of course, that's a view that's held at the heart of Buddhism. And we also have to make a very clear connection between our commodification of the planet, our patterns of consumption, our consumerism, and what's happening in terms of the degradation of our, not just our environment, but also of our whole ecology, including our human well-being, as you, Jonathan, have pointed out. And she posed a vision which comes out of the Christian ethos of kenosis, of self-emptying, and she said there's a fourfold practice. And I just want us to touch into that practice. She talked about the practice of voluntary poverty. Mathieu called it simplicity. She said that we should practice by focusing on the needs of others, which is the practice of altruism and compassion. And then she said we must develop gradually this sense of a universal self, what the deep ecologists have called an ecological self or a non-local self, a self that has moral regard and affection, as you often say, really for all beings. Just as one might feel affection for the apple tree in one's front yard that has been, you know, a provider of shade and apples and beauty for your life. And then she said, we have to model this in our world. In our private life, in our personal life, we have to walk our talk. And as well, we have to model it in our public life. And we have to practice, therefore, a kind of radical interdependence. And, you know, we've spoken briefly here and there, and I think Elke is going to address this issue of the collective commons. You know, why is it that we as a community, as a Mahasangha, cannot actually take this issue into our heart and have congruence between our ethos, the issue, and our actual actions, how we live in the world? Now, in your presentation, Your Holiness, you addressed the history of the Buddha. He was born under a tree. He had his first child awakening under a thorn apple tree. Then he had his big awakening under a Bodhi tree, the first turning of the wheel under a tree, and died under a tree. He had a companion in the natural world who accompanied him throughout every phase shift in his life. And it's an extremely powerful image for us to consider. It wasn't, he didn't have a building as a companion, a church, a temple, a corporation, even another human being. It was a tree that bore witness to every change that he went through of significance in his life. You also said that in the Vinaya, there's reflection for regard of the natural world. And you also spoke about values related to democracy, science, education, and ahimsa, or nonviolence. So Elke is here to help us understand a little bit, I hope, but I think actually a lot, of why we don't act on global environmental problems. What is it that holds us back? What are the cognitive and motivational challenges that we as individuals face, but also that we as collectives face? And what about the role of attention? She will address this. She also wants to address our motivational deficits and what primes action, and wants to explore with us the role of fear. And this is, I think, a very appropriate presentation, actually, at this point in our deliberations. Elke works at the intersection between psychology and economics, Your Holiness. She's an expert on behavioral models of judgment and decision-making in conditions of risk and uncertainty. She studies how attention, emotion, and memory, and their representation in the brain, influence preference and choice. She holds many different seats at Columbia University. She's the Jerome A. Chazen Professor of International Business at Columbia School of Business. She's a professor of psychology. She's also a professor at the Earth Institute, and she's the founder and co-director at the Center for the Decision Sciences and the Center for Research on Environmental Decisions. So I'm very grateful for your presentation this morning, Elke. Please.
Thank you, Joan. Your Holiness, it is a great honor and a joy to talk to you this morning about the psychology of action and behavior change. It is a very active area of behavioral and also neuroscience research with hundreds of publications. I only have time to talk about some results this morning. I won't be talking about the methods or specific studies, but everything I say is actually based on many careful investigations. Let me give you an overview of where we will go. I will address two questions. First, I will ask why don't we act on environmental problems. I will provide you with some diagnoses. Then I take those diagnoses and turn them into treatments, like a doctor would. And we'll look at the question about what... So we take the diagnosis and turn them into treatments. What can we do about the problem? How can we help people to take more environmental actions? So let me start with the first question. Why don't we act on these very important environmental problems that Diana and Jonathan and others have told us about? I will talk about 4 different types of causes. The first one is a very famous paper that was published in 1968 in the important journal Science. It was called The Tragedy of the Commons. It was written by an ecologist, Harden, and he compared these global public goods that we have, clean air, water, to the grass on a meadow in the middle of a village that is accessible for free to all the villagers. They can bring their cows. And he predicted that every villager would bring as many cows as possible very quickly. And in a short period of time, all the grass would be gone. The commons will be gone. That's a tragedy. It will disappear. It's a tragedy because it's a rational thing to do in his view of human nature, in the capitalist economic view of human nature. Self-interest is a legitimate motivation, and it drives the destruction because everybody takes as much as possible. Because if they don't, their neighbor will. Now, we will see, we all know that greed is an important part of this problem. We will also see that this view of human nature is incomplete. It's true that greed is there, but many other motivations coexist at the same time. The second problem or diagnosis has to do with information. Yes, there are some information.
So why would you call it dilemma? Why would you call it dilemma, public goods dilemma? 지배인제 인도가라 상매
그래도 지도 계래서 걸어다.
It's a dilemma because we all have an interest in maintaining the public goods. Without clean air, without water, we're all doomed. We can't continue to exist on this earth. And yet, we deplete and we destroy it. So that is a dilemma. We know we shouldn't, but we can't help ourselves. And the problem seen from the economic perspective is that it's a tragedy because it's inevitable. It will happen because that is human nature. So let me move on to information.
Yes.
So there are two types of informational barriers. One of them is that we might not know what the problem is.
Yes.
Okay? Now, scientists like Diana, Jonathan, have done a lot of careful work, other people as well.
Yes.
And we had the privilege for them to tell us what the causes are of the environmental problems, what the consequences are. But not everybody knows that. We have to make this more known. There's also the informational barrier of not knowing what to do. So you might know what the problem is, but we don't know what to do. And I think we as scientists have not done nearly as good a job at mapping out for the public, for policymakers, what an effective set of relatively comprehensive solutions are. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit tomorrow. But what I want to do today is talk about the two types of barriers about which I have some more information and expertise. I want to talk about cognitive barriers to action, and then also about motivational or emotional barriers. So let's start with the cognitive barriers. I want to talk about the very, very limited attention that we have available to the world. Now, I want to ask Your Holiness whether you remember a video that you saw 2 years ago in Zurich. It was a video of some young people playing basketball. There were some people in white T-shirts and some people in black T-shirts, and they were throwing a ball back and forth. And I think you were asked, maybe by Ernst Fehr, to count the number of times that the people in the white T-shirts threw the ball back and forth, and to ignore the people in the black T-shirts. It was a very difficult task, and I don't know whether you counted and whether you paid attention to the video.
괜찮아.
Zurich dann bege Benjamin Toy 총지 손아.
볼로.
그때 단데 스위스 캐바데기 비디오 스탠스. 디나로리아다 미 리니체 직도동 가보고 직도도 나보고 이제 군이 직지 바로 폴리 요리체. 근데 도동 가보고 이제 되게 폴리 요단 테마 가서 유수 당가 겨로제스. 당가 잡고 그래. 다 당가 제 비디오 때 디멘션 달다는 토나만 나서시다. 템포테스데. And then go on.
And so
it was not shown. It
was not shown.
It was referred to.
Oh, it was referred to.
It was referred to.
Oh, sorry. I was told that you saw it. Yeah. So, but what happens is you pay attention to the people in the white T-shirts, and then what you see when you watch the video afterwards is there's a gorilla, black gorilla that walks right through the middle of the group. But when you pay attention to the people in the white T-shirts, you do not see the gorilla. It's a real blind spot. And afterwards, when you're not paying attention to the people in the white T-shirts, you can't believe that you did not see the gorilla. So it's a very, very great illustration of how limited our attention is. When we focus on one thing, we don't see other things. Mathieu talked about the blind Mathieu talked about the blind spot that many of us have about the consumption of meat. But it's also true that vegetarians have other blind spots. We all have blind spots. There are many things we do not see. And
His Holiness was saying that in Buddhist epistemology, we speak of a particular type of perceptions, which at the sensory level you do see, but at the cognitive level you're not able to recall it. So this is why, because the moment you are able to consciously bring attention, then thoughts have to play a role.
Right.
And thoughts, that's why distinction is made between non-conceptual, perceptual processes versus thought processes. So, and the key point being made by the epistemologist here is that in order for us to
에피스테몰로지를 참았게래. 참았습니다. 루리라.
epistemology 거라. 야가요. now the kind of 로이 남자.
오케이.
유제당 돈 신년을 연로서. So what the epistemologists are trying to make the point here is that in order to
간다와다 배나 다 원부시바 좀 문제 미시로 직계야 그 미기 다게 다 조대만 다게 가는 거죠.
So in order for a perceptual event to occur, there needs to be at least 3 principal conditions, that met. One is the object to which you're focusing. The other one is the sensory, functioning sensory organ. And third is some kind of immediately preceding kind of attentiveness to the object.
It's very interesting. So we have very, very little attention. So we have to be very careful how we allocate it. In fact, there are many forces out there that are constantly trying to get attention from us. And so the question is, how do we focus our attention? Now, from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that our immediate attention will be automatically on ourselves and on the present. Because if we don't pay attention to the present, to the dangers around us, we're not going to survive. And that's good for evolution. It's not so good for more far-sighted goals, for the future, for the environment, for other people. They're not as automatically active and the focus of attention. And I'll get back to that later. So future focus, in some sense, can be thought about as a luxury that we have. It's a luxury of people whose immediate needs are taken care of because we don't have to pay attention to them. Let me also...
그래. 전 재밌는 가십사.
말이다 내가 라레다
아니
간다지.
그거
마음 벌써만 다 해도 다른 내가 없이 롭스 딕되냐 지금 또 상당 바로 와서 가도 그 에볼루션도 내지 되고 그래. 에볼루션 구조 질로이 개조되게 참아 에볼루션도 자와 가르치고 계시에 걸어 봐. 그래서 에볼루션도 시에베는 아주 일을 제법 믿고 때서 다다 왔다 쿠윤 예고지 않냐다고 해도 수술 된 거에 대 그 소소견의 데그돈 그래서
So this focus on ourselves and on the present is good for survival, but it's bad for the environmental action because our attention is focused on the immediate costs of environmental action. Our comfort is reduced, and the benefits are far in the future and somewhat uncertain. Let me lastly say something about the motivational or the emotional barriers that we have to environmental action. And Dan already talked about the fact that it's not enough for us to know with our heads about a danger. We also have to have a fear of it. We have to have an emotional connection to the danger. And we only get that fear, that physical fear, if we can actually see the danger. The problem with many environmental problems is that at this point in time, to non-scientists, they're not very visible. They're very abstract. They're statistics. Diana talked about the fact that we probably would be more scared about global warming if those greenhouse gases that come out of the tailpipes of our motorcycles or our cars were purple, and the sky would start filling up with purple smog. But we don't have that. The other thing is when the scientists then tell us about these environmental dangers and serious dangers, we hear so much about it, and it's always bad news. And oftentimes it comes without really concrete actions that we can take. And that makes us feel powerless and out of control. And Your Holiness yourself said yesterday that if you hear all this bad news, it's natural to just turn away and go on with your normal day. Because if you can't do anything about it, why worry about it? On top of that, and especially in the United States, there's also a great distrust of science. And I think in particular environmental science. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the message that environmental scientists bring is very uncomfortable. So we question their motives rather than paying attention to the message because it is uncomfortable and negative.
진짜 생애 중에 아마 직가에는 사실 지금 정도에 지 난조다 가서 최배 대sem시로다. 지 전리 달려지 가서 그래. 미 구시를 쳐야지 통으로 시주잖아요. 이 생수를 핑계서 시야서. 임바. 나는 공간이 있어도. 전리를 하고도 구유과리야 이 전지부 셰셔디 이지시고 말았어.
Lari, lari.
때 존재 가래데.
So,
나디 캔자 something more kind.
so His Holiness is quite puzzled because, you know, on several occasions when he travels, scientists have come up to him and said that the fact that someone from the contemplative background, you know, the religious background, and also from the Buddhist background, showing interest and showing respect to the seriousness to the science is very helpful because it raises the profile and also kind of regard for science among general public. So having heard that, His Holiness is now quite puzzled. You were saying
And
that
you also
in the US there is a distrust of science in general and particularly environmental science. So why is that so? What is the reason?
Some other sort of reasons of economy, profit.
Yeah.
That's understandable. But otherwise, you see, what is the reason?
Yeah.
Remain little skeptical towards science. Why?
Science.
Yeah. Well, there's actually very little respect for education in the United States.
Education, yeah. That's what you must say. I don't think.
Spoken by a German.
Canada.
And the religious right in the United States also, you know, sort of is anti-science. You know, they
I
take
see, I see.
the beliefs of the Bible very
okay.
literal.
Oh, I think reminds many years ago in Australia. One time, they say, I think one sort of lunch party or something. So we just walk in lawns away.
On the lawn, yeah.
On the lawn. Some media with camera asked me because Simjin Lord Chow Kasha Hong Simjin Kasa.
Dinosaurs.
Or dinosaurs. I is Chigasa.
Yes.
I is Chigus Bartwan to us. You do to us. I am sure sense. Kind of sometimes.
So
Or she watch this and Kozo Kasha and it does. The Jidin Kun, Kunjo Jidin Kun, the Lord Shigoro. Just all this Resa. I am surprised.
So this was in Australia. There was some kind of lunch, and then around that, people were walking on the lawn. So a media person with a camera approached His Holiness and asked him this rather strange question: "Do you believe in dinosaurs?" And His Holiness was kind of struck, and he said, "Of course. You know, we can see the fossil, traces and all of this." And then he was puzzled, so he asked some of the people
later.
So he was puzzled. Why would a journalist would ask that kind of question? And then later he found out that they were among religious believers who felt that those kind of statements contradict the idea that the world was created with enough,
In 7 days.
or a few thousand years old.
All right, so we talked about the problems. I don't want to make it too depressing, so let's turn to some solutions, okay? So what is the takeaway from what we've learned about what keeps us from acting, and what lessons does it teach us on how we can help people engage in more meaningful action with respect to the environment? And so we have very little attention, but we're very rich in goals and intentions. We have a wide variety of different goals that coexist next to each other in our mind. And so yes, the economists are correct. We have many material goals. We have to worry about food, we have to about safety, about shelter. But we also have many other types of goals. We have spiritual goals. We worry about meaning. We need beauty. We have psychological goals. We have to have connections to other people. We have to feel respected. We have to feel loved. We have to feel in control. We have to feel that we make a difference, that we have an effect on our environment. And many of these goals actually are contradictory. They conflict with each other. So yesterday I wanted to fast, but I also wanted to get rid of this feeling of hunger in my stomach. And we want to save for the future, but we also want to buy a gift for our loved one today. And oftentimes we're not even aware of all these conflicts. Yeah? So why aren't we aware more of the time that we have these conflicting needs? And I think the reason for that is that in any given decision or situation, there's only a subset of the goals that are active. And it's only the active goals that actually influence our decision. So a really important question is what makes goals active? You know, I'm going to say a little bit about that.
벌써
또 가정 것도 무슨 일에 수수수 무슨 나로리아 직 되든 담아다 막 부셔줘 봐서.
대지 간다 이러죠. 진짜
그래서 내가 개체주도 그랬으나 자원을 주배급이야. 카도 대 미유단 거든. 문주도 여보 가요. 대슈겐 시부 스테이 그래서. 카도 대 가르 개체지야 돼. 다 디엔산단다 수수 되든 되게 되네. 뒤균도네. 정문주도 숙신부 네트야 달랑으로 가려놨어.
So we know that some goals are automatically active all the time. So it's focus on ourselves, what do we need for ourselves, so focus on the present, that has so much evolutionary benefit that it's always there. We don't have to worry about those not being there. But it's these other more long-lasting, long-looking goals for the future, for future generations, for others, for the environment. They need to be activated. And how do we do that? Now, clearly, our upbringing plays a role in that. The formal and informal ways in which we learn as a function of our culture makes a huge difference. Which types of goals are more chronically active? So a monk from Dharamsala will have a very different set of goals active in his mind than a banker on Wall Street. Different experience, different instruction. But also,
you shouldn't rule out the possibility of monks who might also have aspirations to be bankers.
야, 왜 그걸 주네? 그거 좀 좋아하지 모르지.
He's always saying, given the opportunity, there could be good bankers with big bellies, you know.
But this is a good point. When the monk from Dharamsala moves to New York to become a banker, he's actually also changing his physical surroundings. And one thing that we're not so much aware of is how much our physical surroundings, the context, the oftentimes unconscious things that influence our decisions around us, influence what we do. And so the presence of the Buddha on the wall, the presence of Your Holiness in this room, activates all of my spiritual goals, and I act in ways in which I wouldn't otherwise. Hopefully to the better. Let me tell you about a really interesting study.
다시는 아이패지 쉐벌레 사이언티스트 차 딘데 뭔가 투두잖아요. 사이언티스트 차야 돼. 가서 그래. 그거 마음에 들어.
Yes. So His Holiness saying in his case probably he has more opportunities to become
eventually. There's a more factor to become scientist rather than spiritual practitioner.
Let me tell you about a study that was done in a wine store in Belgium. And in this wine store, they were selling some German wines and some French wines.
No.
And so they did a study where on Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays, they would play German music, German music. And on Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday, they would play French music, accordion French music.
I see.
And on those days when they played German music, they sold much more German wines.
I see.
And on the French music days, they sold the French wines. And if you ask the customers, why did you buy this wine? They had no idea. But it was the music triggered country, and the country triggered the purchase of the wine.
Of course, it's only saying that it may vary from individual to individual, how susceptible you are to the environmental pressures. So if people have very strong standpoints, then they will be less susceptible.
Right.
But then some people tend to be very easily swayed.
Right. It depends on the person. It also depends on the type of decision. For some decision.
I think one example, I noticed India, of course, the English, say, I think,
widespread.
because of many schools,
Lare
they
taught.
taught English, so quite fluent.
Lare fluent.
But they have their own sort of century-old traditions. So among Indian, I think much less tradition.
Like kind of dyeing their hair and among the youth. Dyeing the hair in this very striking youth colors. Yeah.
See, thoroughly educated, modern education, very sort of close with Western culture and these things, but still they keep their own traditional sort of things. So because this is some strong. The West, you see, the people who lacks their traditional sort of
roots, strength in their traditional roots.
Then immediately you see they influence the new environment. So
it shows the difference from individual to individual, depending on how rooted they are in their own cultural, kind of values and traditions.
Me too, French. Any jamming music in jamming shantung.
His Holiness is asking a question to Matthew, if he was, say, Naramankan drinking wine, and will he be swayed by listening to German music to buy German wine?
The problem is I never liked wine even when I was small, so I don't know.
I think typical, the French, many French, even who speak English, who know English, but they do not like to speak English. Whereas German, much more liberal. In that respect, isn't it?
Okay. Let me give you one more example of the effect of surroundings on our decisions. So we know that Europeans are much more environmentally active than Americans. And I think one of the reasons for that is a higher population density in Europe. You cannot go
and the
anywhere.
land also, America, huge land.
Huge land. Sometimes you never see people for days. So if you constantly see people around us, it reminds you of the fact that we are not alone in the world, that we're all interconnected, and that other people matter. And so in this sense, our physical environment really influences our values, because seeing other people primes collective values and collective concerns. Let's talk about a small number of other ways in which we can enable environmental action. And so we talked about the importance of reminding ourselves of important goals, long-term goals, by putting reminders in the room, in the psychological or physical space around us. But also, the work that Greg described a couple of days ago is very important. He described ways of quantifying the environmental impact of our actions or of other goods that we purchase. And by doing so, he provided us with measures for these goals of doing better on these environmental dimensions. Dan, I think, said something that morning about what we measure, we manage. And I would add, what we measure, we actually pay attention to. Measures introduce new goals into our mind and into our motivation. Also, his website is really important because it allows us to keep track of how we're doing. It allows us to see how we're improving, whether we move closer to the goal. And again, that's one of the psychological needs that we have. We have to feel effective, and we have to feel that we're making progress. And that's a great motivator on top of the reinforcement of doing good for the world. It's also, let me then sort of finish by talking about two other sources of richness, two other strengths that we bring to decision making. And Your Holiness already talked about the multiple perspectives that we have on the world as a very important one. We can call things, different labels, and we also can sort of take a different angle, a different perspective on a decision or on a problem. And so it matters, for example, whether I call someone a terrorist or a freedom fighter. It matters whether I call some insecticide a mosquito killer or malaria preventer. These labels themselves suggest that there are different things that these actions or these people do. You gave the example yesterday of shifting perspective. If somebody makes you angry, you want to get away from the anger. It's good to rethink, to reframe the situation as one that's an opportunity for compassion. It's the same physical situation. We just looked at it from a different angle. And in the same way, we can put these multiple perspectives to work for us to encourage environmental action. We can talk about, Sally talked about the fact that we don't have to think about consuming less as a loss in pleasure. We can think about it as a gain in fulfillment or as a gain in health. We can reframe, we can think about these co-benefits in a positive way. Let me end by saying something about 3 different ways in which we make decisions. Any kind of decisions, but also forward-looking environmental decisions. And these ways of making decisions are associated with different processes that are located in different centers of the brain. They're not necessarily separate. Oftentimes they all operate in parallel, but oftentimes we pay more.
자활 주보다 야조 전용 배주진 자활 주보다 이게 레벨에 데스카 가르바스 인타지도 총계 말했다. 변전 약간 가실 배주냐 뭐.
But oftentimes we pay more or less attention to the recommendation that one or the other process makes for how we should act. And so sometimes we make decisions with our head. Sometimes we make decisions with our heart, following feelings, motivation, emotions. And sometimes we follow rules. So let me say a little bit more about each one of those. So when we make decisions with our head, oftentimes following from information.
So can you kind of distinguish them, flesh out the distinctions a bit more, head versus heart?
And basically, so what's the differences, head and heart?
So when I say making decisions with our head, it's a little bit metaphorical. But what I mean by that is that we make, either consciously or unconsciously, we make a calculation. We think about what are the costs of this action? What are the benefits? We're thinking.
Yes. Okay.
And we do this for different actions.
Yes.
And then we pick the one that has the highest overall best ratio or difference between costs and benefits. It's very, very rational. And making decisions with our heads oftentimes is not very good for making environmentally responsible actions. For the reasons we talked about before. If you're asked to give up consumption, the costs come right now. They loom large, they seem like a loss. The benefits are for you, but in the future, far away, for others, maybe in other countries. We don't even know whether the benefits will actually occur. We might be dead, so they're far away. And we value them less, we discount them. The economists say we discount them a lot. And so making decisions that way oftentimes is not very good for environmental action, unless we can reframe the costs as benefits, the way we talked about before. What do I mean by making decisions with our heart? Well, it means that we pay attention not so much to calculations we make, but to how we feel about the option in a much more holistic way. When something feels good, we approach, we actually choose it, we embrace it. If something is scary or makes us feel anxious.
Holistic side can't head.
But when you use the word holistic, it seems to be more in line with the head decision, because you're taking into account all sorts of possibilities, pros and cons.
Well,
whereas the emotion one seems to be more immediate. So you know how.
Okay, so maybe I use the word holistic different from you.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. So let me scratch it out. What I meant by holistic is maybe in a more emotional way, without thinking so much.
So holistic is probably not the right word there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Of course, this is my view.
No.
May not be correct.
But when we make decisions with our heart, or when we try to use emotions to motivate environmental action, I think we have to be very careful that we focus on positive emotions, that we focus on compassion, rather than focusing on fear or focusing on guilt. And it's very tempting, actually, to use fear or guilt. In fact, many of our media, of scientists, try to activate fear that the environmental problems don't necessarily automatically elicit. So we try to help out by showing images of polar bears. We feel bad about the polar bears losing their home. And we try to basically motivate negative emotions. It's very... it's very good at getting attention quickly.
직능은 더 숙제인 거세.
나도 그 지난 배주 제제. 다는데 고유 돈은 야 가발도 싸고
자 소스에 가서 그래. 그렇게도 실례가 있나? 밀포 그랬습니다. 이제 돈 쓰고 그래다.
말해. 들으셨던데 먼저 군주 될 때는 다간다 그게 아크틱이 잡아 되게 매버자. 되게 시도고 그러지. 근데 시비는 마음 발라서 가다 잠을 거라 주제 시비 주라는 강에 시비 되어서 되게 신나란제. 지금 한게 돈에 마음에 지 갱행기 내주지 시제.
이제 먼저세.
말다 간다 지다 모란스나 다 처리병원 대변나. 그 지금 나라니 굴론 깨벌래. 양 굴론데 지 네거티브 돈 담아고제. 캐벤다데 그 돈에 세제제변에 대해서 야유베 소리스도스.
캐벤 도저히 직날이 그러.
라레.
캐벤 돈도 ཉ 고야 코라. 디 도저히 교육 통고.
So in some ways, you cannot really avoid the negative kind of, message, because even if we reframe it in positive terms, the negative consequences is the opposite of the benefit. So it's there, kind of salient.
It's there, but whether it's there in the background or there in the foreground is different.
그래서 더 무엇 지금 문주 삼다인데 독서는 삼다한다. 더 교육 괜찮은 삼다한다. 케이션은 삼다면 됐어. 밑에 미규마를 쓰고 있다. 미규마를 그래.
남자 용주스 가바이니 요다.
나래. 나래.
Can I maybe give one other example?
So this is making the point that in some ways you cannot fully avoid the negative side, because of the fact that you are emphasizing.
The very concept good.
Yeah.
That must be bad.
In contrast.
Otherwise, no basis.
Right. It's
identify as
the other
good.
side of the coin. Yeah. So here's an example out of medical decision making. And so when people have cancer, they can choose between different types of therapy. You can get radiation therapy, or you can sort of take medication or surgery. Right? And different things happen when you take radiation, when you take surgery. Immediately when you take surgery, you might die, but also chances are you will live. But nobody dies, for example, in radiation right away. But after 1 year or 5 years, you have different survival rates or different death rates. So when you describe to a patient what the probabilities are of surviving immediately or in 1 year or 5 years, they make one kind of decision. When you describe the same results as a probability of dying immediately or in 1 year, in 5 years, they oftentimes make a different decision. Now, it's the same information. If there's a 10% chance of survival, there's a 90% chance of dying, they're the same thing. But what's different is where the attention is focused on one side of the coin or the other side of the coin.
So let's still find it quite difficult to
Very good.
But let me finish the point about the effect of negative emotions. So negative emotions are good to get the attention because we're scared, we feel guilty, we pay attention. And we might actually do one thing to fix the problem. But we don't keep the attention very long because it's a negative state. We don't like to be in a negative state. So as soon as we've done one thing, we think we're done and we turn away. And so when you motivate with positive emotions, you don't, the incentive is to stay with it because it feels good. If you focus on sort of the positive benefits, that you sort of feel more meaningful, or that you actually have enabled some species to survive, it's more endurable. It might not be as gripping immediately, but it lasts longer.
그래서 배회직 생활, 배회를 해야죠. 독부집이 너는슬로리. 도도 주는데 이거는 뭐냐 전에다 기부서 숙실 거를 못 쓰는 거지.
There's a Tibetan saying, what's the 독부 is what? Pain or suffering. Suffering or pain is the one that brings happiness to relief. Sharper relief.
They're
more obvious, more evident. Yeah.
More price.
Yeah. To make it more valuable.
So
this seems to suggest that we do need to suffer a little bit.
Okay.
So let me finish and talk about the third way in which we oftentimes make decisions, following rules. And I think that is probably the best way to encourage people to make decisions, for them to engage in environmental action. And there are different types of rules that we follow. So there are ethical rules. The 10 Commandments in the Old Testament is one example. Sally's house rules that we heard about yesterday is another example. And they tell us what's good. In fact, they discourage us to make calculations about costs and benefits, because you're doing something because that's what you do. This is what a religious person does. Oftentimes, we have rules of conduct that come from other social roles. We do things because we are a teacher. We do certain things because we are a parent. And we know exactly what to do when you are a teacher, you're a role model, you act in certain ways. But there also are many more practical rules that we oftentimes follow. And many of those are designed to reduce the conscious attention that we need to allocate to these decisions. So one practical rule might be, I do what I did yesterday, last time. So these are habits. We have habits. We don't even realize we're making a decision. We just do the same thing over and over and over. And that's good if it's a good habit. It's bad when it's a bad habit. We also might have a rule that says, I do what everybody else is doing. So I just watch what everybody else does, and I just follow. And so we follow social norms, or we imitate other behavior. And again, that's good if the social norm is an environmentally responsible one. It's bad when it's not. And so the question is, how do we change social norms? Some rules also have to do with... A third kind of rule says, I'll do nothing as long as I can. So Your Holiness yesterday talked about laziness. And laziness actually can be quite adaptive, because whatever resources we don't use for this decision, we can use for other decisions. So let me show you an example of how we can turn laziness into environmentally responsible behavior. So when you go to a conference in the United States, you oftentimes have to tell the organizers ahead of time on your registration sheet what kind of lunch you want, what kind of meal you want for your lunches at the conferences. And oftentimes there are a couple of meat lunches. You can choose between chicken and beef. And there's also always one vegetarian option. And as you can see here, normally at normal American conferences, Americans are not very environmentally aware, for whatever reasons, because they like meat, or because they don't care about the greenhouse gas emissions from livestock that we heard that Mathieu told us about. But only 5% of American scientists who go to conferences order a vegetarian lunch. Now let's see what role awareness can play. And so the second column here is the BECC conference. This is Behavior, Energy and Climate Change Conference. So about 800 scientists, environmental scientists, that come together every year, and they know everything that Mathieu told us. They know that 18% of greenhouse gases are generated by livestock raising. They know the harmful effects. They're well-intentioned. So what is the effect of awareness? Well, it goes, vegetarian lunch order go from 5% to 17%, 12% more. So it's good, it's significant.
Yes.
Okay. But what the conference organizers did in 2009, they said, let's change the default. Now, I'm going to tell you.
Yeah, you can
Default is the option that will be in place if you don't make a decision when you're lazy. So they said, okay, you're going to get a vegetarian lunch unless you tell us that you don't want it. If you don't want it, it's very easy. You just have to check one box that says...
the form activities the form dinalolia da
제가 해면 사실
mare da lemma debena da ko jig tangro yana shasanye ko da shamasanye ko the ngema na lemma da ni digiti vegetarian member sha ji di kon ta shan go da delia da lemma da ni na ne ma da shasa member kon tangi da slap tu kabla ani kema da sho to samar
렌트비네
kata shasa sanye ma shasa ge members tiwa 다 샤사그메나 나 vegetarian 스타잡 샤사군 스타잡 다 데나로네 촌도촌이 망부제야 랜드 파마테버 용거와 랜마테버데 가르치고 살아도 녜마이나
that 80%
80 so explain can you
so people in this year, if they didn't do anything, if they just said, okay, I'll take the vegetarian lunch, I take no action. If they were lazy, cognitive lazy, they ended up with the vegetarian lunch, and 80% of the people in that year actually ate a vegetarian lunch and liked it. So the effect of awareness was 12%, but the effect of changing the default, turning this into a passive decision, not an active decision, but a passive decision, where you're putting the laziness to work, okay? Now it increases by 75%. So defaults are really very powerful.
근데 고야스면 길은 예부시는 렘마데 되기 디슈스 거래.
라레라 이제 가다치다 미 달레마데 니리 마부 용구로다 미마부 길은 이자 길은 이부 디레 고 배주전 길은 이부 진년디 그 망부 요
다 근데 컬러 땡겐디 그 미게 랭게 마데 디데 딱 가서래 베지테리언 당샤로
라레 디 교다 So it's a proactive approach on the part of the organizer.
Right, right. But it's a beautiful approach because it does not take away the other options. Yeah, sort of in your monasteries, you take away the meat. Okay, so monks don't have an option of eating meat. But some of them actually might need it for their health or for other reasons. And so the beauty of setting the default to the vegetarian lunch but leaving the other ones available is those people who really need it or really want it, they can still have it. But the net effect is almost the same as if you just take it away. And so this approach is much more acceptable in countries like the United States, where the autonomy of choice, of not restricting people's choices, is important. So it's much easier to sell to policymakers to set the default rather than legislate the harmful options away. And this is a device that can be used in lots of contexts. For example, building codes, or food choices, or transportation choices. It also has been used in the context of organ donations. Eric Johnson, actually who's in the audience, has done work on the default being that you are an organ donor unless you decide otherwise, or you're not an organ donor unless you decide otherwise. And different policies, different defaults exist in different European countries. And the effect on organ donations are huge, huge. Okay? And so organ donation is a domain where awareness alone is oftentimes not sufficient. In many countries, we don't have enough organs, for the people who need them and could save lives. But defaults work very nicely. Okay, let me summarize and finish up. So I hope I have convinced you that awareness is very important, but it's not enough. Oftentimes it's not sufficient. It might be necessary, but might not even be necessary always. But it certainly is not sufficient for environmental action because we have these cognitive and motivational barriers we talked about. These environmental problems are really hard. They're complex, they're interrelated, and they pull on many different motivations and intentions that we have. And when we sort of just pay attention to those intentions and goals that are automatically active, that oftentimes gets us into trouble because it's too much focused on the self, too much focused on the present. And so we have to find ways of keeping these other more distant and other regarding intentions active. We have to not only use active ways of encouraging decisions, but also these passive ways. Defaults was one example, but there are other ones. it's important to frame things positively. It's also important to start locally, because locally people are caring about the problem and they have more expertise on it, and also they have a higher chance of succeeding because it's a smaller slice of the problem. And then small success can go up from the bottom to the top. And I think also then we as scientists, we have to maybe sort of work a little bit better at providing people with effective solutions at the individual, at the social, at the political level. And I just want to end with giving you a booklet produced by one of my centers that describes many of the things I talked about.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Elke, thank you so much. That was extraordinary. And Your Holiness and friends, we're going to have a 15-minute tea break. So let's come back here at, what do you think, Dan? 20 after?
No, it's a quarter after now.
Okay, sorry.
Half past.
Okay, 10:30. Great. So, Your Holiness, I wonder if you have some words that you'd like to share with us reflecting on Elke's presentation.
Nothing special that comes to mind, because whatever came up immediately, I had the opportunity to ask Elke directly.
Wonderful. Jonathan.
So once we start discussion, and I think I may find some
Thoughts.
Thoughts.
Thank you. John, you had a question.
So I have a comment and a question. One comment is, as someone who flies way too much, I'm thinking if some of the airlines heard this idea that actually they could probably save money and help the environment by making the default meal a vegetarian meal. And a certain percentage of people would choose meat, but they would actually save money. They're looking for ways to save money. So I wonder if any of them have caught on to this idea, because of course on an airplane, most people don't specify what they want and they just get the meal that's available. But probably no one's pushed this to the airlines yet, I suppose.
No, but we should think about doing that.
Yeah, I think they could say, we're going to save the environment, and actually they're really saving a lot of money, since meat meals are a lot more expensive. But my question is, there was this idea that that you mentioned about certain types of contexts of decision. And basically it seems that much of the point of your presentation is that when we make decisions, there are actually a lot of factors that go into the decision that are not just about our rational examination or analysis of costs and benefits. And that I think I take His Holiness's point very well, which is that probably we're always making some kind of analysis and a decision that's purely emotional, actually a state that is purely emotional and not cognitive in any way, doesn't seem to make sense to me. But that certainly our emotional state could affect the decision. And I actually have two questions in regard to that. One of them is, maybe you could clarify a little bit more or tell us something more about the research in terms of decisions that are motivated by negative emotion. So we could be motivated to, and this is also used in the context of Buddhist practice. So sometimes we talk about the Chiwa-mitakpa, the contemplation of death and impermanence. And actually that can create sometimes a state even of concern or even fear. It can be called a sort of negative emotion in the way you were using that term, but it can be used to motivate practice, especially in the beginning. But you're suggesting that when you motivate, when a decision is motivated by a negative emotion like fear or guilt or regret, like gyopa in Tibetan, then after you make the decision, you stop paying attention. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I was saying.
Can you explain that a little bit more? And then I have a follow-up question, if I could.
So let me answer that first, and I also want to get back to your notion about these different ways of making decisions operating not necessarily exclusively, but also in parallel. So ask me about that one again too.
Okay.
We'll start with a fear. And so negative emotions are unpleasant. So in fact, they're very motivating because they are unpleasant. It's a signal, a flag that goes up and says, look, something is wrong, something needs to be done, do something. It's a warning signal, and that's why they're hardwired. We always have these either positive or negative reactions to a situation that's telling us, is it safe, or is it dangerous? But these emotional reactions were created in simpler times. They were created at a time where the danger was the tiger at the watering hole. And as long as you can stay away from the watering hole at the time that the tiger is there, you're okay. And so there at those times, simple actions actually remove the threat.
So you can stop thinking about it.
You can stop thinking about it. You do one thing and you're done. And I think that's one of the reasons why when we do something because a danger flag has gone up, the flag goes down after one action. So that's one reason. The other one is because the state itself is unpleasant. So we actually have a motivation to get out of it as quickly as possible because it's not good. We know it's bad for our immune system to be in those states. So again, it's adaptive to get out of it quickly. So I think these emotions are good to capture attention. But then we have to somehow think about how to reframe the situation in a more positive way so people have a motivation to stay in it and keep the action coming.
Well, and my follow-up question then is, so there's a lot of research about this that demonstrates if you motivate by you're saying that if you're motivated by fear, you engage in the action and then you forget. So basically, a faculty like mindfulness or denshe would not be active anymore. You're not going to pay attention anymore. The danger's over, you stop. So you're saying fear is actually not a very good motivator for action, is what you seem to be saying. Is that true for all kinds of people? Is this research done on people who are even, let's say, very analytical? Is it just a certain percentage of the population? Or is it pretty much everyone who shows this? Because part of what I'm wondering is what the role of are there cases where an analytical approach can overcome all of these different biases?
So it's a very good question. I think you're asking several questions in parallel.
Yeah.
So one of the questions has to do with individual differences. And we haven't really talked about this very much, both in my talk, but also in general. We never talked about gender differences, for example, when we talk about environmental concern. Maybe we can come back to that later. But your question has to do with sort of cognitive abilities. And many of those cognitive abilities actually have to do with the way our brain is wired. And so we have some areas, the prefrontal cortex, that are responsible for planned action and for cognitive analytic processing. We have some areas of self-control that sort of help us override these impulses that we all have, that help us override the focus on the here and now. And for some of us, the connections between those centers and our deeper down emotional centers, sort of amygdala for fear, the connections have different strengths. And then some of it is genetic, some of it is environmental. And those differences in the way our brain is wired does translate into more accessibility and use of these different processing modes. So absolutely. Now, when we do these studies that look at the effect of negative emotions, sometimes we study 100 undergraduates at Harvard. Sometimes we study like 800 people in the general population through some internet survey that's done in the United States. One thing we don't do very much at all, and it's a really bad deficit, we don't study people in developing countries. When we talk about people, we're basically talking about Americans and sometimes Europeans. And typically, it has gotten better. Now we study people with a broader range of socioeconomic backgrounds and age and education because we do more studies on the internet. But until 10 years or so ago, we basically talked about Ivy League undergraduates. Now, when we talk about things like the brain, that's not such a big problem. Except for things like age, and gender differences, that does make a difference. But when we talk about the effect of values and education and the environment, we really have to look at a much broader range of the global population. And I would encourage everyone who has sort of access to national science foundations, sort of to facilitate that type of research, because right now it's not very simple.
Diana.
Well, Elke, as you know, I love your research, find it fascinating, and I'm privileged to be on an advisory board for one of her centers. And so I know that there's so much more that you could have talked about. So I'm going to mention 3 things, and you don't have to respond to all of them. The first is I would really like you to expand on the issue of differences between men and women in their response to the environment specifically. And if you could talk about what we know about whether women are more caring or less caring and how we would think about it. The second is I wondered if you could talk about how your research would apply to a specific attempt to change behavior. So if I asked you, well, I want to ask you, it's a real question, is supposing we want people to change their energy consumption in the US or middle class India, how would you recommend we design a program? Not necessarily a policy, it could be an information program or policy or whatever. How would you design that? And then my final question was, you sort of presented Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons without the critique that Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for saying actually Garrett Hardin was wrong. So,
Now, let me comment on the last one. I did say that this view of human nature was extremely limited. But I think it's worth noting that there is a lot of greed in this world, and a lot of short-sightedness, and a lot of destruction of our public commons and our public poor resources. So we should not disregard that argument completely.
Yeah.
So to your first point, which is gender differences. And so there are actually sort of large national surveys in the United States and also international surveys, over probably the last 10 years or so. And across surveys, so the number one determinant of environmental concern, and also sometimes, it's not always measured, but some environmental action, like including maybe how much you are donating to NGOs that try to solve environmental problems. The number one determinant is some sort of measure of political belief. How do we see the world? Are we more conservative or are we more liberal? Are we Republican in the United States or are we Democrats? Then the next determinant is education. And it's for political affiliation, it's obvious. So if you believe in a more hierarchical social structure and you believe more in capitalist economics, like a Republican would, a conservative would, you're less environmentally active or concerned. Next one is education. And there the relationship is the more the education, the better the education, the more we are concerned. And so education really does help and does matter, and we have to pay a lot of attention to it. And then after that, we get into other demographics, and their gender comes up pretty quickly. Income first. And so if we are more wealthy, we actually are more environmentally aware. This gets to the point that concern for the future, for future generations, for the environment is a luxury. And if our immediate needs are taken care of, we can afford that luxury. And that's true both within countries. So people who are more wealthy in the United States are more concerned. It's also true across countries. Wealthier countries are more concerned because, again, they can afford it. And then the next one is gender. And then, of course, it's in the obvious direction. I probably could take a poll, but I think we all know women are more concerned about the environment. They actually donate more to organizations like the QS.
how big is the difference? Do you know?
It's not a huge difference, but it's certainly a significant difference. And so the size of the effect goes down with the categories that I mentioned. And so I listed them in order.
Could I make one?
Sure.
I think that ties in very well with Greg's points, actually, because one of the big levers and points of pressure on companies is shoppers. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that women do actually the bulk of the shopping for a family and are informed and motivated, they can become a very powerful pressure for companies to clean up the supply chain in the way Greg has mentioned.
Mm-hmm. So, the effect is there, and some of it might be visible.
다가다 첩세그 랑조도네 기반도스 조 liberal teaching and the shugude any shevyu mayoche the shugus de ya kepemeni porul des pumete chote ya koyu toltona cheda simkuchya yebesoritus
usually some scientists they found one male, one female watching a person who passing through painful experiences. Then response from female side is much stronger.
Much stronger, yeah. More empathy.
So therefore, I think logically, once they know the seriousness about ecology, because of degeneration rate, their response, I think, must be stronger. 제가 체류들이 시작해서 디실사시. 뭐시까라. I think very simple reason or factor.
A factor.
Look, birds or dogs. Father enjoy.
Go away.
Finished.
Yeah.
The mother take care.
Right.
Weeks and months. And in human case, years. So this is a biological factor. So like that. And basically, I think same. Basically, same. I think as far as brain is concerned, I think female, male, I think not much differences, isn't it?
A few, but not much.
So I think those are the potential knowledge, potential of the cities, because of the
sense of caring,
positive emotion. I think basically the same. So much depend on. Again, now 1,000 times to repeat the awareness, education.
At the risk of keeping education one more time, Jimpala mentioned yesterday that the children in his household having a big influence. Are there studies? Are there reasons? How would you speak about the way in which perhaps, in fact, your research shows that children are a wonderful way to influence families, and why would that be the case?
No, I think that's a really good point.
His Holiness is saying that, if you could allow him to make this point, one thing that we need to
with respect
is to avoid the tendency, just because there is a small example, that somehow then applying, kind of extrapolating it out of this in a disproportionate manner, that sometimes can be a tendency which applies also to Jimpa's example.
So billions of human beings, I think each case there are differences. We cannot just take for granted. Right?
That is just
pick up one thing.
Yeah.
Oh, all human beings like this. Cannot say. Even twin. Some cases, the physical sort of structure almost sort of identical.
Yeah, identical.
But emotional level, intellectual level, there must be differences. So this is difficult. Usually, I had the impression, you see, I don't know, many people, you see, they look, so they are a special field, they find something, then they say, oh, everything like this. I think that's, I don't think.
His Holiness
that's unscientific.
Yes.
His Holiness was actually citing a phrase which comes from Tibetan scholastic tradition, which goes like this: picking up a grain of wheat and then arguing that all the grains should be exactly the same like this.
So anyway.
Thank Your Holiness, is really the spirit of the question is, do we have research which shows that this is a powerful factor, or that, in fact, no, children are not a strong influence?
So in this case, actually, Jinpa's example is a good one. And it,
다른 데이터를 배정 거에도 야부도 쓰고.
and the way to think about why children can be a force of change is to think about the fact that many of our decisions are not deliberate. A lot of what we do that influences or affects the environment are habits, and they're by and large bad habits that we have. We're the old dogs, and we have our old tricks. And you know how hard it is to teach old dogs new tricks. And so one way to think about environmental change is generational. Yeah? And so as education instills better habits in young people, they will do what's better for the environment. But it doesn't have to end there. The children that go home also become agents of change in the home. And just as Jimpa was triggered to think more about his garbage and about his recycling, all the time when I go to restaurants and I see grandparents sitting together with their grandchildren and I overhear the conversation at the table, a lot of the time it has to do with climate change or with waste and with environmental problems. And it's always the grandchildren sort of lecturing their parents or grandparents what to do. Yeah. I give a class at Barnard College, which is a college that Columbia has for young women. And I give a class in a class on the Arctic, one lecture in a year on decision making. And all the young women come to me afterwards and they want to know, what can I tell my parents about environmental change? Because they don't think it's important, they don't believe it. And so that's what they want to know. They know about the science, that's great, but they really want to know is how to convince their elders that this is something they should act on.
I think one different, I think, the young one, their mind more flexible. So get some new information, they pay more attention. Then elder people like me, something fixed here. So that, I think, some differences, maybe. I think on brain level also, you may have some sort of explanation. The younger one, still growing. So new information, immediately to respond and pay much attention. Then gradually, and because I had to become bold. Now I also, now becoming like that. So that our brain become harder. That I think some differences. So our real hope is future generation, younger generation. I often see it expressing, my generation belongs to 20th century. We really create a lot of problems. Now problem, not only that century you face, but also now beginning of this 21st century, some problems due to past mistake or past negligence. So now, my century, and you also, I think, we belongs to 20th century. So our century already gone. So we are ready to say bye-bye. Now the young people below that, 30, 40, 30, 20, below that, these people really belongs to 21st century. And also, you see, the younger generation. So I think our effort may not much influence the elder people, but our effort, our information, I think will receive, can receive these younger generation. So these are the real humanity who have the ability and opportunity to change this century, be century of peace, century of dialogue, century of compassionate century. Then, even though the global warming become more because of intense way, intense, but still remaining human being work together whenever some problems there, share each other. Then at least you see some problem there, but at least on human level, we all have the sense of brotherhood, sisterhood. Someone passing through difficulties, but mentally, emotionally, the rest of humanity look after us. Mentally, much happier. Isn't it? At this moment, so therefore, you see, younger generation is the real, our hope.
Source of hope.
Source of hope. So we, through your sort of professional sort of
work,
knowledge, professional, and open their mind, open their eye.
Sally, if you would make a comment, and then I would appreciate hearing from one of the representatives of the 21st century, Dekila. I know you also had a question. So Sally.
Good, that's good.
Yes, well, those of us of the century past are counting on the younger generation to help us, to be sure. One of the things, I have two granddaughters, and I'm aware of the things that Elke has been saying, that they are being trained in schools to be more concerned about these issues. But one of the things that concerns me is the deficit in young people of what I would call close encounters with the natural world. Something that television and the internet and all these indoor activities have made it very difficult. I was brought up in a one-room cabin. Well, no, I mean, we had a one-room cabin on Cape Cod, and I had a lot of close encounters, just running free in the woods and being able to go and hunt turtles and do things like this. And a lot of children now are deprived of that. They sit in front of a television set and they're instructed about the right things, but it can't take the place of experience, of being actually to have free time. You go outdoors, you're not planned. Your mother says, where are you going in? You say out, and they say, what are you going to do? I don't know, I'll think it up, be home for dinner. Kids aren't brought up that way now. And I really wonder what the deficit is then in developing profound empathy that is not just intellectual awareness, but the kind of feeling for the natural world that comes only with the experiences, long experiences in childhood of these close encounters.
Thank you, Sally.
다 간다 지구유다 제와 니리 미스나로리아 제와 작은 메디오칼라 디토네 대간다 지 선물을 코비네 용어에도네 디 메디오칼라 디토네 강한 가르체고나슬
엘 보주시고 지금 7월도 시대되네 저다 지금 러면서로 지금 전전서로 저기 나한테 통과다 다 남인기 뒤진치기 사버지 별로배 봐. 로칠 도대비스타지 마도 즉 대야 즉도 14호로 전에 analyze shadow 등급도 봐. And mindfulness 등급도 봐.
So one of the problems that we see among today's youth is that
in modern lifestyle
in general as well is that in addition to what you pointed, but also the constant focus on external stimulation, whether it is listening music or watching sports or
attention.
Exactly. So it seems like
relying more and more sensorial, less and less use deeper sort of intelligence,
mental faculties. So it's only saying that it's almost like deliberately seeking distraction, so that you deprive yourself of the opportunity to go deeper into something with more kind of focused attention.
I think you see. I think worthwhile to carry some sort of research. I think Tibetan and also I think in India, the tradition is learning by heart and analyze. So their mindfulness may be stronger, and sharpness of mind also you see stronger. Then you see look. Just relying
completely
mainly on sort of sensorial sort of
stimulation.
Well, Well, this goes back to a question, if I can just hold your questions for one moment to the Diana's second question, which had to do with, what kind of program would you design in order to enhance, young people's capacity to make decisions that are based more in discernment and moral responsibility?
So Diana's question was actually how to encourage everyone to be more energy efficient and reduce their consumption of energy in the general population. That's a slightly different question, or I would say I would have slightly different answers to that question than to your question that might be sort of aimed more at young children. Young children also, in addition to having fresher minds, they're more idealistic, because they have less material needs to take care of. Their parents take care of their material needs if they're fortunate, and so they have more space, more attention for idealism, for others, for the future. And I think in the case of children, I would actually sort of try to encourage them to more consciously make decisions that benefits the environment, and maybe to think about how to translate their enthusiasm and their intentions, to others, in their community, in their family, and out. Because again, children love to have an effect. Now, one of the reasons we love video games is because there's always the promise of improvement. The next time around, you might get better and better and better, and it becomes almost an addiction to try to get better. And it's bad in the extreme, but it's a very powerful need that we have to sort of improve and to show mastery in something. And so for young children, I would actually advocate a much more active and deliberate and mindful approach. When it comes to adults, we all have busy lives, right? And we have to worry about not losing our jobs. We have to worry about not losing our spouse. We have to worry about making the mortgage payment. There are many things that are on our minds, and sort of using less energy is way down there. And probably rightfully so, because we can't save that much money from a material perspective. And even from a carbon emissions and global warming perspective, one of the dismotivating things is this drop in the bucket thing. Sort of my action has so little impact on what happens in the big scale that it's it's not even worth worrying about. And so, given that these sort of more conscious calculations of costs and benefits are not going to be very effective, sort of for those kinds of decisions, I think these passive, encouraging passive decisions that are benefiting the environment are really important. And so whether it's sort of setting green suppliers of electricity as a default, right now, basically sort of, your electricity comes from coal plants, or nuclear power stations, unless you make a conscious decision that you're willing to pay more and get green providers. And there's lots of debates whether green providers really are much better, but let's assume for a second it's better to get green electricity. Then I think sort of making that the default, you don't have to get it. If you don't think it's worth it, and if you can't afford it, you can opt for the cheaper, dirty energy. But why should the dirty energy be what everybody gets if they don't make a decision? Why not make the socially and environmentally beneficial action the thing that everybody gets if they don't make an active decision? Or installing programmable thermostats, sort of where you once, while the issue is hot, you just watched the what is the truth, the inconvenient truth, and you want to do something for the environment. You come home, well, that's when you set your thermostat, and it's going to be 10 degrees colder in the winter, and you don't air condition as much in the summer, and while you have the good intention to do something.
10 degrees, you mean Fahrenheit, though.
Yeah. but then it's set. After that, you don't have to worry anymore about it. Until there's a power cut, yeah. And you have to worry how to program the thermostat. It's not so easy, yeah. So maybe we should use the teenagers to program their grandparents.
Claire.
So this goes back to the issue about negative emotions and concerns a sort of broader issue in environmentalism. So I guess some of my colleagues will know that a few years ago, two environmentalists published a paper called The Death of Environmentalism, which caused a big kind of splash in the environmental field. And one of the things the authors argued was that environmentalism has always portrayed its message very negatively. And they compared environmentalism to the civil rights movement and said Martin Luther King didn't achieve anything by giving an "I have a nightmare" speech. So he said, "I have a dream" instead.
environment ki net to dikite there's shukshimo mate jum sangas environment shin sang ma tu so janja na shete gorbas and this civil rights movement on shebe na Martin Luther King ki tu san ma shebe dan khura su shekera chimbe nga mi nilam de ju se ji ton sangjo na shebe.
So their argument was that environmentalists need not to frame the message as being one of deprivation, not doing things, restraint, but rather one about, they've understood it as being about green jobs and you know, the ways in which environmentalism could create a more flourishing economy. And that positive message would encourage people in a way that a negative message would discourage people from acting. That seems to fit in with some of the research that you're talking about. So I wondered what your observations were on that kind of argument.
No, I think that observation is very much in line with some of the points I've been trying to make this morning. And also it's very much in line with some of the cool benefits that several of the speakers, you know, sort of have articulated, you know, whether it's health co-benefits, you know, or whether it's economic co-benefits, or sometimes it's actually national security benefits. You know, sort of our energy supplies are internal because we're generating them from renewable sources rather than importing them from the Middle East. So I think, you know, emphasizing the positive impacts of behavior that also, as a side effect, is going to solve or reduce our environmental impacts, I think is a really good one. One thing you have to keep in mind is you have to have different positive messages for different groups. You know? And so some of us are concerned about sort of too much consumption because it's, some people call about it as the hedonic treadmill. So you do more and more, you work more and more, so you can buy more and more, but you never get happier. So you have to try even harder. You know? And we all, you know, want to get off the hedonic treadmill, and that's, you know, powerful motivation. And there's a lot of, you know, sociological and social science research that more consumption does not buy us happiness. You know? And so people should know more about that. And so that would be sort of one way to doing it for one group. Other groups actually like the hedonic treadmill, but if they can save money by being, you know, sort of more environmentally aware, by having sort of, you know, a footprint that is smaller because their workers are healthier and they can make more profits, well, what's wrong with using that to motivate that group? Yeah? And so I think so the negative message tends to be more general, and there's also then therefore a tendency to use that because we all should be worried about living in unbearable heat conditions, yeah, sort of, you know, or losing the glaciers that give us, you know, so much joy by contemplating it, or we can go skiing on them. So the negative messages tend to be more common and shared. The positive impacts, I think, are more specific and localized. So it's going to be a more complicated message. But in general, I sort of share that sentiment very much.
동해지 세야게 털면 여대버지기 행동은 것을 쳐라. 동해지 세야게 털면 다시 현점이다.
With respect to the role of negative so this is partly in response to Claire. So particularly the reference you made to these two critiques who wrote that paper. One of the things about the role of negative message and pointing out the negative consequences of certain behavior and events and so on, if you do not tie it up with suggestions for solutions, then generally these kind of approaches are not that effective. But if you
I think logically, these sort of problems, including ecological problem, due to some part, I think, due to our negligence. So logically, certain problems, certain sort of problem or causing suffering due to our own negligence. So therefore, logically, if we pay more attention, then we can overcome that. So, like one patient, a person who have some serious ill because of that disease there, but not realize I am still fitting. Then never pay, never make effort to take medicine. That's a foolish. It is very important. Oh, you have some serious disease, so you should take care or more cautious. So similarly, if there is no way to cure illness, then better, your health, okay, no problem. Then better. But if there is a possibility to cure, then must tell illness. Similarly, you see, these the problem which we are facing, essentially our own creation. Therefore, logically, we have this ability to change that, to reduce that, isn't it? So it is very, very important. Make clear the negative side.
Negative consequences.
And the Martin Luther King, I have nice dreams.
I have a dream.
I have dream does not mean because of nightmare dream, positive dream. So why positive? He wish positive dream. You see, because of that materialize. Because there is some problem. Because this is discrimination. Certain lack of right. Because of civil right. So he realized that this is wrong. This is causing suffering to many people. So these are not made by God, but made by leaders. So he come out and speak. So can change.
So His Holiness feels that definitely we should not ignore the importance of really confronting
I think
the negative
I mean, that kind of critics, I think, one-sided. Lack of holistic or lack of realistic approach. Realistic awareness.
So, Your Holiness, there is one issue, though, that one gets an impression, even in this room over the week, that we've heard a lot of bad news. And you said we also need a method, a tablama method.
Oh, yes.
So if you're given bad news and you're not told what to do, that's, I think, one of the main problems. So there's seems to be a lot of emphasis on the bad news, and it's important for us to recognize the bad news. I think that's clear, and I really appreciate the way you made that clear. But even I personally, and I heard some other people in the room over the week say, well, what do we do? What do we do? What's our vision, to use Sally's word, of the future that we can think of as our dream? So in some ways there is a sense that there's just a nightmare. And there isn't a dream. It's just all bad news, and we don't know where to go, even as individuals. And I feel that sometimes with the environmental movement, even before I got involved in this meeting, that I was very concerned. But really, what I could do practically seemed to be beyond me. So I think that may be one of the issues that those critics are pointing to as well, is that there's not enough sense of what's, in practical terms, what can we do to really make a difference?
So, John, I think that's a perfect question, actually, for Dekila to comment on. You've got our 21st century representative.
Wow. I was actually going to start with just a personal story, which is that I became an environmentalist at a very young age, and I don't know why. And I was sent to the United States to study, and with my friends, we created a recycling program that we were very proud of. We recycled, we collected all the garbage and we sorted it. We took it to the town center. And when I went back home to Sikkim, I told my family this very proudly. And my grandmother was horrified. And what she said was, we sent you to the United States so you could become a street sweeper. And then, so I couldn't change anybody, at least at that level, at that age group, their minds that the environment really mattered. But this is where, again, the role of religion is so crucial, because His Holiness the Dalai Lama and His Holiness the Karmapa both have really made environment a focal point. And then 4 or 5 years ago, I was home, and one of my oldest aunts came to me and said, she was very proud of what I did. So I asked her why, and she said, because His Holiness the Dalai Lama thinks it's a very good idea that we protect the environment. So I think even if maybe people cognitively don't understand the problem or haven't figured out the solution, I think there are so many other ways, so many other types of motivation we can use for people to change their behavior. It doesn't have to be that we convince every single person that this issue is the burning issue, because everybody has a different set of concerns that comes to the top, what you were talking about, the set of goals that are active. And I do think it's unfair that we as environmentalists demand that the environmental issue should be on top if somebody has a child that's seriously ill, So I think we ourselves have to be very compassionate to everybody else. And the question that you had, John, I think the real challenge for us is that people don't shut off about the environmental issue. And this, I know you touched on very briefly, which is when information becomes overwhelming. It seems to me that there are types of people like me who actually really enjoy getting information. And we come alive when we get a lot of science and facts and we enjoy it. And then there's a whole group of people that shut off. They get overwhelmed because they aren't being told clearly how to make a decision. What is the criteria? How do you judge? I mean, and this is something we grapple with in the field every single day. Do I put the community's rights first? Do I put the species' rights first? Do I put the forest rights first? There has to be these mechanisms to help us make decisions. And we're designing it because we're just learning about this problem. So I suppose everybody has to practice patience as well.
Wonderful, Dekila. Mathieu, John wanted to speak next. Jonathan, and then you, please.
Yes, Your Holiness, I fully agree about that we've caused this problem, therefore we can do something. I think the good news, bad news that Diana presented, that we are now in the Anthropocene, we have affected the climate. The good news is that we have affected the environment and therefore we can change it. It's not just happening without us. So I appreciate that. I do have a question though for you, Your Holiness, and the monastics here. And that is that I've been learning more about Buddhism and the incredibly intensive training, especially in debating, that occurs in your training. And here we're talking about the most difficult challenge, changing people's minds, changing people's behavior. And so because you practice this and study debating, and I'm wondering if you have some best practices and secrets to add on to Ilke's presentation and how you come about and what your approach is to changing people's minds and changing behavior, and can we apply your expertise to this issue?
Of course, the environment field, we ourselves are very new. But one thing, the way we are training, as you mentioned, through debate, it's very helpful, you see, to get the awareness of the meaning very precisely. So
those who are trained in the debating tradition will never really fall tempted to this example that was given by picking up one example and then extrapolating disproportionately.
Precise shibshia kudusade zozolya ngobe nezuko ta kazo casual mongu yebijinzane any chane shawas riksu nawas that
Well, sometimes there's also a kind of a mismatch because the debate training emphasizes so much clarity and precision, and of course reality is much more messy. So sometimes then the concept you have to start using words like belonging to that kind of type or from that perspective. So you have to use all these caveats,
So I firmly believe you see, the technique, the way study, it's the last, I think, more than 2,000 years, particularly in Nalanda tradition, you see, debate, each sort of meaning,
point, each point.
So we, till now, you see, we carry that tradition. I think, I already said it, since it's a few years, I express now that technique can be used in modern education subject, different subject, but same method. Then I think even the student, of course, those more sharp-minded student, I think may develop more interest about the subject if you use that because of that.
So if we use the debating method as a form of teaching, so for example, we often use a kind of entailment. If A, then B, necessarily B, and if B, then C. Those kind of entailment and also making very fine conceptual distinctions. There may be no material distinction on the physical level, but conceptually, because looking at it from a different perspective, you can make conceptual distinctions. So once these kind of ideas are brought in as part of the method, they can be, it may be more attractive, engaging for the students as well.
Then knowledge is very, very clear.
Clear. Yeah.
Clear distinctions. Then this also, you see, they very helpful. You see, to develop samjung shiro sayadi. 저는 samjung shiro ligrwa.
Because also one of the benefits of this debate style education method is that it enables the person to...
There are sort of 3 levels of understanding. One, understanding merely on the basis of hearing. The second understanding on the basis of you get some sort of rough knowledge through hearing. Now analyze by yourself.
It's critical reflection.
Critical
reflection.
So then your awareness really becomes very firm. First level, if another person say, "Oh, this is not right,"
something different,
then they may feel, "Oh, this may be true."
So it remains just a hearsay. At the first level, it's a more of a hearsay. You have the information, but it is only verbally kind of derived.
So
the second level of understanding is conviction-based. So this is where it's critically, it's derived through a process of critical reflection.
So here, this debate is immensely beneficial.
To take the knowledge from the hearsay level to the second level.
If someone say, "Oh, your view is wrong," then you have sort of a lot of reasons. This is right, because of this, because of that. The first level, if particularly someone believes, because of the belief something, they're like Kama Rinpoche or Dalai Lama say something different, then they immediately shift. You see, "Oh, this might be true. My view is wrong." But the second level of understanding, and even Dalai Lama say, he still say, although Dalai Lama stated that, but I thoroughly analyzed, so this must be true. Even Buddha come, say something different. I have plenty of reasons. And why you state that? That is important. That's important. So therefore, Buddha himself, you see, express, "Oh, my follower, scholars or monks should not accept my teaching out of faith, devotion, but rather through thorough investigation and experiment." So that's a very scientific way to approach. So therefore, these masters, Nalanda masters, you see, they analyze Buddha's own word. Although Buddha said this, but this goes against our experience or our reasons. So this, the 장준을 is.
So then the distinction is made between what can be taken at the literal level, definitive meaning, and what is a provisional statement that requires further interpretation.
So therefore, I think this is, I feel, from Nalanda tradition can make some contribution regarding the method to educate in education field. No. This I feel. So now since we came to India, now 52 years passed, our school established almost now 51 years, but still we never implemented this. Yeah, really. So
of course that raises the problem, since we cannot do it, we haven't been able to do it ourselves, there isn't much basis to tell others to do it.
So I'm, because of that, appealing, say, our institution, and particularly those people who understand English and some modern education, are appealing, including to the Jimba. Now should sort of that, because of that, the love to the Sokuis, Daksadan. I don't know, just Sundana, Namjin, the Madus, got teaching Stogan Rajama, the Shashaki, but that is just South. So that I'm doing worship jig. Good Daksadan. Sunda Chigori, but Daksadan. Yan Godama, Sholkashi Tons, Gondama, she Ming said, the six said, any tell much of huge dancer, that's it. That the other one. That was good for what.
So His Holiness was saying that he has been making requests among the Tibetan scholars who have expertise in both modern scholarship as well as classical Buddhist scholarship, to try to make attempts to develop teaching material, like textbooks and so on, that would use the debating technique but on contemporary subject matters. He recently saw a textbook that was created by an young Amdo scholar on traditional Tibetan grammar. But normally the grammar is not taught in the debating method, but he has used the debating techniques to teach the traditional grammar, and which seems to be quite interesting. And His Holiness was saying that he read the first few pages, and right from the beginning he has used that kind of monastic debate technique.
So I really hope within 1 or 2 years, I think we can produce some material in modern sort of the education subject. Use the 1,000-year-old Nalanda tradition debate. This I feel, but otherwise I don't know.
So, Your Holiness, thank you so much, and Elke. And I'm going to ask Mathieu and Sally if you'll hold your questions until this afternoon. I mean, it's been an extremely rich session this morning. And thank you, everyone, for listening so attentively. We'll gather again at 1 o'clock.